This is Dan Schneider, and on this edition of the Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with Julian Darius, a creator and scholar of comic books and the founder of an organization called Sequart, and I will be doing that in just a moment. All right, as I mentioned, my guest today is Julian Darius. He is the founder of an organization called Sequart. He's also a comic scholar and creator. Julian, thanks for being on the show. And I know that I first found out about your organization a few months back when I wanted to do a show on the Watchmen, and I read an article by a writer who had written for your organization. If you could tell people a little bit about yourself, your life, your interest in comic books and graphic novels and whatnot, and how you came to found Sequart.
Sure. Thanks for having me here. My name is Julian Darius, and I basically read comics since I was a little kid. I think that in many ways, comics taught me literature. I certainly read novels and books at the time, but comics were really my passion. And, I liked superhero comics, and they sort of gave me an escape, especially when I was kind of a depressed kid and dealing with things. And I just never stopped reading them. And I analyzed them as literature. I took apart their stories. And by the time I got into college, I became an English major, which certainly was, at least in part, due to comics. And I found that my professors at the time, this was sort of in the mid 90s, did not really respect comics as a literary medium. And I had read, sort of Scott McCloud. I had been reading, Watchmen and Dark Knight and all this stuff and Mouse since I was, relatively young. And I just knew my professors were wrong. So what I did was I took HTML classes back in the early days of, the internet becoming something that most people could get on and were aware of. Um, and I just started writing basically papers for the internet and compiling resources on comics. And people joined me. People wanted to be part of it. It got a lot of traffic, and we formed Sequart in order to advance comics as a legitimate form of art, and just naturally moved into book publication, and then eventually documentary films about comics.
Okay, so it's Sequart. I'm sorry. When I interviewed the fellow a few months ago, I thought it was Sequart, meaning sequential art.
Yeah, it is for sequential art. I mean, I say sequential art, so
Oh, okay.
Sequart, but it doesn't matter. We're
Okay.
not picky about it, and it really doesn't upset us one way or another.
All right. So I know I'm 50 years old, and you look like you're about in your mid 30s. So when you first got into comics, what year was it? What like era? Because I know there's like a golden age, a silver age. Then there was the post Frank Miller, the mid 80s Frank Miller when he became big. So when did you first start getting into comics?
Well, it was in the 80s. I was born in 76, so I'm a bicentennial baby. And I certainly read comics growing up, even younger than this. But the first comic that I remember really diving into and sort of doing a deep dive into, and that I felt was my own, was Flash #1, the sort of post-Crisis on Infinite Earths reboot with Mike Baron and Jackson Buse on art. And it was spectacular, and I read it over and over and bought every issue. And this was sort of the heyday of mature readers content. So I was, like 10 years old reading Checkmate and totally psychologically traumatized by a blade going through a man's hand and things like this. But I it was very much this kind of post Frank Miller era that you're talking about. Um, uh, you know, this was sort of the heyday of all of that revisionism. Watchmen was still relatively new. Crisis was still relatively new, and I dove into that stuff. And for me, I also went back and tracked, uh, Silver Age stuff, especially. I just dove into it, and I read everything that I could. I read stuff that was great and not so great. I just read everything. But it was really in that 1980s revisionist period that I um, really got into comics in, a non-dabbler way.
Um, we'll talk a bit more about superhero comics specifically and about retcons and things like that, whether it can be literature or whatnot, later on in the interview. Let me start though, talking about specifically your own comics. So, well, let's talk about Sequart first, and then we'll talk about the Martian comics, which you started. So you started Sequart, what, in the late '90s, was it?
Yeah, it was. I think it was 96.
Okay.
Um, and again, just while I was an undergraduate at the time.
And so it started out as a website. Is it now like is it a for-profit organization? Is it a company then, an actual company?
Yeah, it exists. It's sort of grown, and it started as a website, and then we sort of spun it off. At the time, it wasn't even called Sequart originally, and but it was this kind of compilation of resources, and then other people came on, and we realized that it had a kind of nonprofit identity. Today, we're more of um, we're a combination of website and book publisher and documentary film producing company.
Now, I remember about 20 some years ago, I worked at a magazine distributorship, and I remember seeing all the comics that came in. And there was I think it's now defunct, an a book called Wizard, a magazine called Wizard, which was sort of like, did you start out with doing something like that in mind, or is it supposed to be more scholarly?
It was supposed to be more scholarly. I mean, I had read Wizard and I liked Wizard, and but Wizard did stuff like very glossy 3-page spreads of like who would win in a fight and
Yeah.
stuff like this, and they had interviews and they had other stuff that was more meaningful. I was actually more inspired by the fanzines. I was more inspired by stuff like that I had tracked down, where fans of comics had attempted to create not just meaningful interviews with creators who, in some cases were starting to die, but also guides and listings of issues with pertinent information in a time when none of this was available digitally and you had to track this stuff down. And so I use that as a kind of jumping off point to try to create a kind of to take that and start edging it into what I was learning about scholarship in my own studies, and then that kind of continued as I went on to graduate school for English.
So this would be, so basically you'll deal with anything from like the big DC Marvel stuff to Robert Crumb and everything in between.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I read all of that and everything in between, and I still do. And I think that as an organization, I think we were one of the first to sort of take superheroes seriously as something that you could talk about using literary theory and things like this. But we have always said that, and it's very important to me that we don't discriminate based on genre. And so I like the idea of readers reading all of this stuff and being voracious about it, and certainly having their own preferences, but not being pigeonholed into one genre. And that was something that I think the Comics Journal, especially by the time that I, was reading it, certainly was anti-superhero and was maybe too much in the other direction. Um, and we didn't want to. We wanted to be eclectic about it.
Um, yeah, so let's talk about the Martian comics. Well, is that the first comic series that you have started and published through Sequart, or is this, number three or four? I mean, what is your history as for your own personal comics that you're the primary creator? Is that the first?
Well, that's a complicated question because it is the first. It's not through Sequart, it's through our sister company, Martian Lit, and that's
Oh,
in order to create a kind of firewall so that the integrity of Sequart is protected. The idea is that Sequart as a site and as a business that is in the business of reviewing comics, analyzing comics, shouldn't be compromised by also publishing comics. And that is a kind of, I'm not sure that other people care about that, but that's something that I care about and
yeah.
that, is important to me. So it is the first comic from Martian Lit. I have been writing comics since I was a kid. I just never found an artist who would stick with it and follow through to finish producing the comic. Um, Actually, when I was about 16, I went to a lawyer and I had drawn up a business plan to basically create a comics company. And I had researched, sort of page rates and all of this stuff, and talked to him about venture capital. And I'm kind of a control freak, so when I realized that investors could just kind of pull their money and take IP and everything collapses, I thought, no, this is not for me. And it was really it took 20 years until technology kind of caught up and meant you could do it a lot cheaper.
So is Martian Comics then online? Because you sent me PDFs of the first couple of
hmm
issues, so it's all online then.
Yeah, it's online. We've yet to produce something in print. Now we just finished I mean, actually, Martian Lit also publishes novels and things like this, so it is has done print before, it just hasn't done print comics. Now for the recently completed Kickstarter for Martian Comics 3, which is a double-sized issue, um, people want print, and so I like digital. I read a lot of comics digitally. I also read in print, but we decided to produce a trade paperback with the first three issues, so we will be doing that. But I think that for an upstart company, the financials just make so much more sense doing digital and then potentially releasing something in print when you have a collection or something like this. But the economics of doing print for every single issue is mind blowing. I mean, it just doesn't make a lot of sense.
So do you then actually? Well, first, are you the writer, and do you also do the drawing for the comics?
I don't do the drawing. I'm a writer, and I drew a bit as a kid, and but I gave it up. So I have different artists who work with me, and I actually co-created the series with another writer, Kevin Thurman, who's also worked for Sequart in the past and is a good friend of mine.
So do you actually do the drawing then, or do your illustrators do the drawing on a computer, or do they do it the old-fashioned way and then just scan it in?
Yeah, that's interesting. Some of them do it the old-fashioned way, and some of them do it on the computer.
Oh,
And I don't do any of the art. My art would, I sometimes do sketches for the artists, but it's not professional quality.
um, uh, let's end this segment with this final question, though, because I just wanted to make sure. So, Sequard, would you also cover comic strips? I mean, do you do the history of comics like Little Nemo and Slumberland and Crazy Cat and that kind of thing as well?
Oh yeah, and I love that stuff. I've read quite a bit about it and quite a bit of it, and that's totally fair game. In fact, our understanding of comics is broad enough that if somebody wanted to do an analysis of, say, the Stations of the Cross as a kind of comic strip, I mean, we would publish it. And we have published about that. I've written about Little Nemo in particular, which is dear to my heart. So yeah, that's certainly fair game.
And you said Martian Lit publishes books. Is it mostly just analytical books, or is it like genre sci-fi fantasy lit?
Yeah, some of it is literary fiction, and some of it is genre fiction. The whole idea of Martian Lit is to not necessarily do edgy stuff, but to do stuff that is smart and different. And I think that there's a place for that, especially as the big publishing houses are so commercial and so highly processed. You've got, really a sort of pyramid of writers working for the big publishers, that only the people at the top does it make sense to really put money behind and promote. And so if you're not a Stephen King or somebody like that, it's very tough. You don't get these sort of display stands in the stores. There are very few stores now anymore. And it's said now that it's harder to get your second novel published than it is your first, because what they tend to do is they publish the first one, they don't put money behind it, and if it doesn't do well, you're sort of out of luck. So, the point of Martian Lit is to do stuff, basically that I like, that is, you know, edgy in some way, intelligent in some way, different in some way. And sort of the tagline is that it's kind of, literature from Mars, that it's a little different.
And is it print on demand that you said that you do physical books too? So is that then print on demand?
Yeah, we mostly do print on demand, but we also do small runs to fulfill orders for specific stores. So,
Okay.
if we have an order in for, a few hundred books or 1,000 books or something, we can print those up, and we do that. But we also do print on demand for small runs, a few copies or whatever.
All right. Well, let's end this segment. When we get back, let's talk specifically about, or start with Martian comics themselves, the idea, the first few issues, and what the general plan is for the future. And we'll do that in a moment. Back with Julian, Darius, and let's talk about Martian comics. We talked a little bit about the business end. Let's talk about the creative side. You had mentioned that you write the comics, but you don't physically draw them. I saw the first two, and unlike you, one of the things, even as a child and to now, that I've been turned off generally by comic books is the overflow of superheroes. I'm old enough to remember when there were gangster comics and cowboy comics and war comics, and I found them a lot more interesting than just these big goons running around in underwear. And one of the things that I found interesting about the Martian comics was it doesn't seem to, I mean, it has a fantastical element, but it isn't superhero based. It's about a girl who may or may not be crazy or whatnot, and it has certain elements going back to the John Carter stuff from Edgar Rice Burroughs, whether she can be there. And I found that much more interesting. They weren't quite as long as I think typical print comic books. But what was the basis of the story? Did you want to definitively go away from superhero comics, or what?
I don't know that I wanted to go away from superhero comics so much as, I mean, I'm 38, and even though I grew up in superhero comics and I grew up in a time when superhero comics very much dominated, um, it's strange to me, as it is to a lot of people, that an entire medium is dominated by a single genre. And so much has been done in superheroes. I think that's great, but the idea of this was to do something different. And I've always been a fan of sci-fi. At the same time that I kind of grew up reading comics, actually a lot of what always appealed to me about superheroes were the sci-fi elements. Like Silver Age Flash would have like the Flash facts, and especially DC superhero stories from the '60s would tend to incorporate, or superficially at least, order the story around a sci-fi element. And I always loved that. And I grew up reading sci-fi novels. That was probably what I read most, besides comics. And so I'm a huge sci-fi nerd. And, this was an attempt to do that. I don't know that it's a definitive turn away from superheroes as much as just kind of the kind of comic that I want to exist, the kind of comic that I want as a reader to have available to me.
Well, it's certainly the first couple of issues that I saw. It seems to me a bit more subversive in terms of its political content. One of the things that I did notice that you if I read a Batman or a Spider-Man or one of the big boys or even something like a Spawn, which I remember from the 90s, you'd occasionally get some political angle hammered in there, but I found a very kind of subversive anti-capitalism, anti-materialism vein through the first two comics. Was that intentional? And also, is this a series that if you can do 100 or 200 issues, will go on, or is it a planned miniseries of a dozen or 20, issues?
Well, I'm one of these writers who things spiral out of control. I always write too much and edit down and edit down and edit down. And so originally this was going to be a much shorter story. It was going to be solely focused on what has become sort of the first story, as you talked about, sort of a girl who is may or may not be crazy or may or may not be possessed by some kind of Martian intelligence designed to enlighten us. But it's grown from that. I don't know that I would be able to write 100 issues. I certainly have a long-term plan here with multiple arcs and multiple characters, but it's much more of um, a sort of literary thing than just sort of like the next story featuring this character. Um, in the sense that, like, for example, the first story is about that girl. The second volume is a collection of short stories, kind of like Martian Chronicles by Bradbury. So it's not necessarily linear in quite the same sense that we're used to in comics. As far as the political elements, um, I'm very political. I wouldn't say that I'm anti-capitalist. I mean, my politics are certainly liberal from American standards, but I consider myself a capitalist, and I don't know that I'm maybe as liberal as some of these stories. But I also think that it's the duty of a writer to follow through on the premise and really take the time to think through that premise. And in the story, the sort of concept is that you have this very sophisticated Martian culture that looks at Earth as a kind of, sort of one big tropical island. Like, they're wrestling with cell phones. We have holograms in our heads, man. Like we're all living in this kind of hyper technological utopia, and the problems that we wrestle with on Earth and that we wrestle with currently, whether it's like social media and just feeling disconnected from each other. There's a kind of way in which, as we move into virtual space, whether it's online or here we are doing a Skype call. I mean, all of this is amazing, and there are ways in which this technology kind of connects us, but there are other ways in which I think especially young people, but probably all of us feel alienated to some degree. And so we have, like Facebook friends, and it's like, well, are those real friends, or it's easy for them to wish happy birthday, but they're not really around us. What does it mean to take Instagrams of the food you're eating? Not rather than enjoy the food, but in addition to, um, this is college really about becoming an educated citizen anymore and exploring all of the possibilities that life has to offer, or is it just been corporatized and just kind of something that you do after high school in order to get a piece of paper to get a job, which in my estimation is utterly worthless. That's not what college was to me. And so, I mean, all of these themes are kind of explored, and it just made sense for that Martian to, I mean, that Martian's not going to care about money. That's not going to care about, greenbacks, with presidents printed on them. To the Martian, we have a kind of, primitive utopia. I mean, the Martian is to us as, we were to say Native Americans in the New World, where we romanticize them and at the same time look down on them, and it's a kind of complicated relationship that's not simply positive or simply negative.
Now, there's people like H.G. Wells, War of the Worlds. I mentioned Rice Burroughs with the John Carter stuff, Ray Bradbury, The Martian Chronicles. I'm sure there are a whole host of lesser names. How do you approach a subject like sort of the mythic Mars and the canals and the whole Percival Lowell stuff without treading on a lot of trite tropes? How do you revivify it? Do you just step aside, or do you develop new ones on your own?
I think that's such a complicated question. It's easily observable that basically stuff related to Mars has not done very well commercially, especially in the last 20 years. It's kind of a joke that it's sort of the kiss of death. And we'll see. There's this movie, The Martian, coming up based on the novel. We'll see whether that changes this. But
Well, I think if they found water, if they do find anything in
yeah.
the next 10 years of real life having been on Mars, I think that'll change the whole zeitgeist.
Well, I hope so. And I think that, there probably was, at least single cellular life on Mars. I think everything I've seen indicates at least single cellular life is probably pretty abundant in the universe. But I'm very moved by these kind of like old fantasies of sort of the next planet over, and this idea that it's a very romantic idea. The idea that sort of our solar system could be teeming with life and different civilizations, and you certainly see it in older science fiction. And I love all that stuff, and I think that something's been lost there. That Mars was always, I mean, all these other planets and any alien planet we write ourselves into, and we write versions of ourselves, and we use to explore ourselves. But Mars was always special. Mars was always sort of the next planet over, and it could be, colonizer and colonized. I mean, it was colonizer when we, could imagine that it was, teeming with highly advanced life that would just kind of develop space flight before us and therefore potentially colonize us. And that was especially a fear for, Western society that saw itself as the king of the hill. What if there's another hill, and they're going to come over in H.G. Wells style, just do what they want because that's what we had done to the rest of the world. Um, and of course, then we discovered, okay, if they are canal beds, they're old, they're dried up, and there's no life there. And then we sort of shifted gradually toward, as in Bradbury still has the aliens, but we sort of shifted into more uh, colonizing stories of sort of colonizing Mars. And even today, Mars holds a kind of special place in our imagination. I mean, it's kind of the next stop after the moon. Um, and I think it's kind of the other planet. And I think that, like stories of counter Earths, of Earth's rotating, opposite us in the orbit of the Earth, which we know doesn't exist, but this idea of the other, of this kind of mirror self that we project our own fears onto, we project our own dreams onto as well. It's something that's deeply resonant to me. And so the challenge with Martian comics is how do you do something like that that plays with these kinds of pop stereotypes and this kind of history, and yet responds to the fact that we know Mars is, if not a lifeless planet, at least, not filled with cities with Martians waiting to colonize us. Um, and I think that is potentially responsible for this failure of, Mars as a subgenre. And so, I have been sort of trying to do something different to sort of avoid stereotypes like, aliens built the pyramids and all of human history is really a consequence of, History Channel style alien intervention, I think that deprives humanity of its accomplishments. And so there's a lot that has to be balanced. I mean, I don't think that you can depict Mars, sort of John Carter style anymore. It seems it's fun, but I mean, it seems kind of unrealistic. So I've got the cloaking thing set up. I've got this whole sort of history of Mars Earth interaction set up that kind of delicately attempts to thread this needle, and whether it succeeds or not is entirely the reader's call.
Well, let's move out a little bit then from you, Sequart, and the Martian comics. And let's start with the comic books as literature thing. I know a few years back there was a big brouhaha on the film critic Roger Ebert's website where he dissed the idea that video games could be art, and I agreed with him that they couldn't be, but for a different reason. Because for me, video games are competitive, and art is in itself not competitive. It's a communication, whereas games are I'm going to win or lose. And when the thing with the comic books as literature, I started writing as a poet, and to me, there's always a tacit acknowledgement for people that poetry is the highest art form, because everything is always compared to being poetic. His guitar playing was poetic. Her acting was so poetic. Her this, and it seems to me that when I hear the kind of thing about comic books being literature, it's trying to strive to be a higher art rather than being a new art. Because to me, when I think literature, I think actual writing. Whereas with the comic books, you can have an image that can dominate the main center of the medium that pages to write. So it's fundamentally different, and it seems to me that it would be better to just say that it's the visual arts, whether you're talking film or you're talking comic strips or comic books, rather than literature. So why do you think that comic books are literature rather than their own art form?
Well, I think they are their own art form. There's no doubt about that. I mean, the fusion of art and the printed word is not unique to comics. I mean, you certainly have illustrated novels and things like this, but you're right that it is its own art form. And so, sort of the motto of Sequart is, comics as a legitimate form of art. I use the word literature because it's printed. And so you're right that the visual is not only there, but probably dominates. And certainly has come to dominate more in American comics as time goes on. And we move towards sort of more decompressed comics that have, not every panel is filled with captions and word balloons. So, I mean, certainly comics are its own thing, its own medium. So is film. I mean, film is not a visual art. I mean, film is a visual art plus sound today.
Yeah.
So, I mean, film is its own medium. And the cool thing is that every medium can do things that others can't, right? So, the thing about film is that, I mean, this is changing a little with, first with home video and now with digital. But the idea of film is, I mean, usually you have one aspect ratio, and you can't really, if I mean, in theory, every frame is a panel, but it's presented to you across time rather than across space.
Yeah.
So, the reader can't, or the viewer can't control that pace. And instead of the printed word, I mean, sometimes you get the printed word on screen, but you have an audio track. And the play between audio and visual, and combined with the control that a filmmaker has over the pace, it allows you to do things in film that you can't do in any other medium. And that's fantastic. And I think arguably the best things in film are things that simply cannot be duplicated in any other medium. And I think the same is true of comics. The difference is that because comics puts images across space, and because it does have the printed word, I mean, to me, if you have an audio track to a comic, it's not really a comic anymore. I mean, if you make like a comic movie, you put the panels in some sort of viewer that controls the reader's pace.
Yeah.
That's not really a comic anymore. It's some kind of like hybrid, internet form of art. But I think that because it is printed on the page, because we still have the page as unit, even in digital comics, and because the word is printed, it is literature in that sense, that it is a printed page that you read at your own pace. And I think that's something that appeals to me very much.
So, in other words, you're qualifying the term literature for your own means, then, rather.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that is the easiest way to present the concept of comics as art to somebody who might be new to that idea. That it has this uniquely literary quality of sort of the reader being able to move at its own pace. I mean, it's not unlike a sort of like, when they used to do, books of like film stills, right, with little descriptions underneath. Um, that's essentially comics. It might not be good comics, but it's comics. It's on the printed page, and then the reader controls it. I think that that is, it's a form of literature, but it is this kind of printed. The reader controls the pace of the story, the pages unit, all of these things that are traditional literary devices. And so, and I do think that, while we've adapted a lot of techniques from film, like, panels that increasingly, zoom in, and we use this terminology when we write comic scripts,
Yeah.
that's certainly the case. But I mean, a lot of literary devices do translate into comics more than film, simply because it's printed on the page. So, I mean, I'm glad to back off of, comics are literature, um, but I still think there's something there that informs our understanding of what comics is as a medium.
Yeah. Because three things come to mind. For example, suppose I gave you an essay, for example, that said describing Marilyn Monroe, but I
Mhm.
removed the title, and I'm describing this blonde woman. Now, maybe I'm more attracted to her than you would be, or vice versa, but I'm describing her. And you're someone who's never heard of Marilyn Monroe, you wouldn't get that image. But you just look at one of Andy Warhol's images of Marilyn Monroe, and boom, it's Marilyn Monroe. And we know that. And also, if you, for example, read Huckleberry Finn or Moby Dick, your Ahab is always going to be different than my Ahab, no matter
Mhm.
how much it's described by the writer. He's got a crooked nose, he's got this, that, he's got a scar on his left cheek. It's going to be different. And film or any medium is always going to set that in place. For example, and my third example is I remember when I worked at the magazine warehouse, and this was right at the time of like the death of Superman, the four Superman reboot or whatever you call it, and there was a side story involving the Green Lantern where his home city got destroyed by Mongol or something, some big with
Yeah.
some motor city or whatever that came down and just wiped out his city, and I guess that set off the then Green Lantern lead character to become a homicidal maniac for a while. And there was one comic that ended. I remember finding it very touching because he's there and he's sitting and he's walking around his city and he's interacting with the characters and whatnot. And then we see it's just a bubble in his head and he's sitting like by a stream or something, dreaming about the city. And that is something that would have taken 3 or 4 pages to do, yet in just one panel it caught that. So that's what I mean by the difference is you got the pathos of Hal Jordan's loss. There's 5 or 7 million, however many died in the city that was destroyed, and in just one panel with one little bubble, acknowledging its art form, uh, it superseded, or maybe not superseded, but it had a totally different way of getting that emotion that would have taken, even if I could write 5 pages of superlative prose, there's no way I could be that instantaneous as that one panel. And so that's one of the reasons that I brought that issue up. But
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
these are all great. These are all great examples, and I think that, let me give a fourth, which is silent comics. I mean, you can do comics without a single printed word.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't argue that at least theoretically the visual trumps everything. Um, and so we're left in this kind of space in which comics are kind of printed visuals, sometimes accompanied by words. McLeod says images in specific sequence. There's no doubt, I mean, in my mind that the visual is primary there. But because it's printed, I mean, there are effects. I mean, you can control the aspect ratio, right? I
Yeah.
mean, you can also, I mean, in that sequence you're describing, the reader can pause on that image and kind of consider it and muse over it in a way that is not necessarily the case in film.
Yeah. Um, let's then back out a little bit more and just talk about how superheroes came to dominate the medium. So let's put on your historian scholar cap for a moment. Um, as I mentioned, I'm 50 years old, and I'm old enough to remember sort of the last dying gasp of the war comics and the gangster comics of the late 60s, early 70s, and whatnot. And I found the stories, whether they were doing of old 30s guys like John Dillinger or just made up stuff or the war comics, which lasted about a quarter of a century after World War II, you'd get some human stories. And speaking of the Watchmen, there's that comic within the comic about the guy who's the pirate, which I actually found more interesting than the Watchmen exterior comic. I would have preferred to have read that comic myself. I'm also old enough to remember, getting 3 comics in a plastic bag for 25 cents when you'd have Scrooge McDuck, Little Lulu, and Felix the Cat or something.
Hey,
Um,
hey, me too,
yeah,
me too. I bought those too.
yeah,
I had those Odell comics, as a kid,
yeah, Del, yeah.
and
And I also grew up. My first real experience with comic books outside of them was the Batman TV show. And what I loved about that, and I think I'm actually going to do a show later on this year about saying that 1960 to 1980 was the real golden age of television. And that's one of the great show. It's a great show. It's hip. It's intelligent. It's satire, and it's not only satirizes contemporary 60s culture, but also the comic book medium. And I always found that Batman so much more fun, so much more interesting than the Dark Knight. And okay, I can understand. And I know Batman supposedly started out dark, and there was Bill Finger and Bob Kane and whatnot, and then he had the Bat Dog and Batmite of the 50s and 60s, and then we got the Adam West era, and then we got the more socially conscious 70s, and then we get now 30 years of this dark stuff. And I mean, quite frankly, yeah, the Killing Joke is an interesting like one-off comic, but it's so dull. I mean, can there be a duller character than Bruce Wayne and Batman? I mean, how many times can you have some psychopath? Arkham Asylum goes, and then on the Superman side, I can't find how Superman was ever interesting. I remember the year you were born in 1976. I was upstate New York at a friend's summer home reading comics from the late 40s, and there's one comic where there were from like 52 or 53 where there were space bugs, and Superman had to dive into the sun, and the bugs weren't incinerated or whatnot. And it's like it just seems so dull. And yes, Marvel was better, and I'm not saying that there aren't good comics here or there, but to me, as I said, superheroes have always been sort of these psychotic freaks that if they lived in real life would be sort of like radiation to cancers, that they could almost be worse than the bad guys in the damage they cause. So why did they come to dominate? I find that interesting that while gangster and war comics and whatnot, as far as I know, maybe there are small presses that still do them, but they're pretty much dead. Can you explain?
Yeah, I can. But first let me say I'm also a huge fan of the Batman TV show. In fact, Sequart published a book about it, edited by Jim Beard. And so we take that seriously. I'm a huge fan of that. I think that I have what I like about, say, The Killing Joke or things like this or Watchmen. I like that kind of literary maturity. I mean, I like the sort of like devices that are used in, say, The Killing Joke of sort of the the first panel is the last panel. It's evocative, it's poetic, if you will. I mean, the inside covers, continue that panel. It's the idea of a comic as almost an art object. That was all very new, and I responded to that stuff. I don't know that I responded to the ideas of what was being done with Batman, but I think that now, it's 30 years later. I mean, um, and I have a similar feeling, and I think that especially as I get older, I have I'm sort of a mentor to a child who I've seen grow up, and he's really into Batman, and we're just at very different stages in our life in which I tell him, like, Batman is basically a rich guy who beats up poor people. And I see, like, he plays, like, Arkham Knight, and I watched him play, and I think, like, okay, another Batmobile got blown up. Why are you spending, God, $200 million or something to develop a new Batmobile every year and replace the ones that get blown up? Start a homeless shelter, man. Like, how about you do something to actually help people? Um, let the cops handle these criminals and maybe give them better equipment and training. But I mean, there's lots you can do besides go on your own personal vigilante quest. And I think that the energy that Miller and others, and Alan Moore and whatnot, brought to the superhero of sort of saying, like with Rorschach, hey, if you were one of these guys, you'd be messed up in the head. I mean, this is kind of a messed up genre. Um, I think that they were using it to psychoanalyze the genre and implicitly the readers. I think that, fast forward a few decades and that psychological edge has been lost, and now it's mostly just, hey, isn't it, cool to watch Batman drag a guy from the side of the Batmobile, or torture somebody, and that's not cool to me anymore.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm with you on a lot of this. I mean, historically, we did a movie all about this called Diagram for Delinquents, which is directed by Robert Emmons Jr. And, it explores Frederick Wortham and sort of the crusade against comics in the 40s, and then through the hearings in the early 50s. And, really at that time, you had a plethora of genres. The superhero did not, maybe arguably dominated, especially during the first 5 years of the 40s. But by the time you get to the second half of the 40s, romance comics, crime comics are huge. And, they're not necessarily all that mature or sophisticated. The art is, good sometimes, but usually not. And they're certainly exploitative. But there was this great flowering of sort of no holds barred, write whatever genre you want. Um, and that really died with the Comics Code. I mean, what you're talking about are sort of the last vestiges of that, as, code approved, sort of genre comics, romance comics, horror, things like this, which, I read too, and I liked. But I think that really it goes back to the Comics Code. It goes back to, the rules of the Comics Code were that you couldn't even depict authorities in a negative light. So, you could not have a corrupt cop. The bad guys had to lose. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, these are requirements that essentially guarantee that an entire medium is going to be kids fair, and the worst kind of kids fair. So artists and writers were able to sneak in issues and sneak in stuff, but this is a series of rules that were, I mean, even the MPAA is nothing like what the code was originally. And so I think when you fast forward and you see what this does to comics, certainly the superhero genre benefited from that. And in fact, there are some theories that, the code itself was, really aimed at closing down EC and closing down these profitable non-superhero companies in favor of, funny animal comics and superhero comics, which, could flourish under those kind of regulations.
So you're thinking,
So
so as I'm getting, you're saying that the comics code was a way to sort of get rid of the real life John Dillingers who are thought to be more scary than, say, the Red Skull.
yeah, exactly. I mean, and you couldn't do Dillinger. I mean, the kind of Dillinger story you could do after the code is a kind of um, very tame, sort of,
No.
castrated version of that story. Um, and it benefited publishers who had staples of superheroes like DC and what became DC and Marvel.
Yeah.
And I think it was calculated, at least to some degree, to do exactly that. And I think when you fast forward like to the undergrounds, I mean, the undergrounds are certainly a reflection of 1960s counterculture, but they're also a reflection of a medium that has nothing like this. And I think that some of their excesses, while reflective of 1960s counterculture, are also reflective of a really repressed medium, and that they chose to work in a really repressed medium that had nothing like this. I mean, it's like, imagine if the only films you could make were PG films at best, and most of them G films. PG is like pushing it. If those were the restrictions on films, you might have an underground film market that just says we're going to make all hard R, content here, and we're going to distribute it ourselves. So I think that that's a reflection of the same kind of repression, and because of that repression, the superhero flourished. I mean, superhero stories did well under those restrictions. And they were sold to kids, and it's because of this that we get not only the dominance of superheroes, but also the idea that comics are only for kids. And certainly there were good stories produced, good writers, good artists, who good editors. I grew up on Julius Schwartz stuff. I love it to this day, but I think it's really because of that these other genres eventually kind of die out, and you get this sort of like incestuous. It's not just superheroes; it's kind of like incestuous continuity focused version of superheroes,
Yeah.
and it's very bizarre. Warren Ellis says that it's kind of like, imagine if you go into Barnes and Noble and the only novels you can find are about nurses,
Yeah.
and it's all the nurse genre. And you can find some other stuff over in the corner about other stuff, but boy, this is not healthy for an entire medium. So,
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I'm not a big fan of M. Night Shyamalan. I think his movies are a bit too gimmicky. But his best movie, I think, was the best comic book movie I ever saw, and that was Unbreakable. And that's because it ends with the possibility. You're left wondering what is going to happen, what is going to be. The Bruce Willis character, is he going to become corrupted? Is he not going? It's sort of like it ends right where Peter Parker, after Uncle Ben has died, and we don't know what he's going to do next. So it starts out realistic and it slowly goes into the fantastical. Whereas when I've seen, I mean, what is it, with the Wolverine, what is it, not the Avengers, what is it,
X-Men.
the X-Men movie, and I
Yeah.
saw the first three with Tobey Maguire, the Spider-Man, and I saw the Dark Knight Return, the first Batman one with Bale, and the second one, and I mean, I just have to feel that in 5 or 10 years, people are just going to be sick of these movies. And do you think that the films are going to have a negative effect on superheroes, and that we might get a return to gangster or war comics, or something? I mean, a comic about the fight against Al Qaeda or ISIS or
Mhm.
something. I don't know.
Well, and I think that Frank Miller, although I don't agree with his politics, I mean, he certainly tried to do that. I mean, I am a fan artistically of Sin City, and he did Holy Terror, which I think is disgusting from a social point of view. It's obviously Islamophobic, but I mean, he's at least trying to do something different, and um, you know, and is addressing sort of Al Qaeda. I mean, I would like more of this diversity, and I think that maybe we'll see that. As far as the superhero movies go, yeah, I don't see it. It's a fad, and I don't see it lasting forever. Um, you know, I just it's bizarre, uh, and I don't think most of them are very good. You know, I think the interesting thing about Unbreakable is that it's basically a revisionist superhero movie. I mean, it's basically trying to do in many ways like what Batman Year One was trying to do. Sort of like, okay, how would this really work? And you know, Batman Year One doesn't even have a Batmobile in it. I mean, um, you know, and I think it's a good movie. It's a very solid superhero movie. You know, and it's doing something that's sort of realistic and taking the superhero one step at a time. Um, but I think we've seen so many superhero movies now. I think you have to do something different. I think you have to do something that interrogates the superhero a little, does something a little different. Maybe, as you said, um, explores sort of the damage that would be around the superhero. And maybe Man of Steel and the coming, you know, Snyder, you know, Batman v Superman will do some of that, but you know, it also glorifies the superhero in a sort of way that I don't know deserves to.
Yeah, I
You know,
know. I was going to
I
say, I one of my favorite comic books when I was a kid was in the late '70s. The original Godzilla Marvel comic books. I think I have about 16 or 17 out of the 24 issues. And one of the reasons I liked it was because here was something from a different like crossover universe, Godzilla, that was powerful, more powerful than all but maybe Thor. I think Thor was the only superhero. I think he Godzilla tried to topple the Empire State Building. Thor held it up, or something like that. But I wanted to. Speaking of Thor, I know that there's always been when I've read a few articles and stuff about comics that superhero comics specifically, that it's compared to the old Greek and Norse and Roman gods and whatnot. And I want to talk about internally about retcons and uh, why they don't let superheroes age. To me, if I think of Batman, if you talk about Batman franchise as a film, you would think that it would be much more interesting if, let's say, Bruce Wayne in 1939 was Batman until the early 60s, and then Dick Grayson took over until the mid 70s, late 70s, and then so on. That you would get, it would bring a more rich history. You talked about like the Crisis on Infinite Earths, and then in the 90s, I think they had another reset at DC, and
mhm.
Marvel has done a reset, and now they've and it's just and so you have like Earth 1, Earth 17, Blue Earth. There was Blue Superman, Red Superman, Superman who farts out his ear. It's like why why to me it would be much more interesting if they had just kept one continuity. And Watchmen, in this degree, there was a couple of generations of the Watchmen characters, which I did appreciate that about that book. It just seems so okay. Yes, you could say Clark Kent doesn't age because he's an alien, and some of these other Galactus and whatnot would age. But the Flash would age, Batman would age, Aquaman would age. Wonder Woman, I don't know if she's considered a god or whatnot, but she would age. It to me seems so much more interesting dramatically. Imagine instead of the old character from Watchmen, who we really don't know the background of, the old gal who's in the home and her daughter becomes the second version. I forget the name, but imagine if Diana Prince, had her own daughter with, say, Clark Kent, and in the 1970s, Diana Prince is in a nursing home or something, and you could build such a much richer history instead of all of these retcons. So I took it. What do you think about these retcons? To me, they seem unnecessary, and they seem to me to actually work against the history, or at least internal diegetic history of the comics.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that if somebody wants to do a story of a different sort of Batman or a younger Batman, I mean, let it be an Elseworlds, let it be an imaginary story. That's fine. I mean, one of the things that you touched on is, you know, to me, especially true of DC, that, you know, DC was a generational story. And it had, I mean, the DC universe was, and you had the Justice Society in the 40s. You know, whether it was pre-crisis, sort of, you know, set on a different Earth in a kind of multiverse, or it was post-crisis. You know, there was two generations mainly of superheroes. Um, and then you had the idea that, okay, Flash died, and his protege, Kid Flash, became Flash. You know, Wally West was Flash, and that was defined him as part of his story. And you had inheritors to the Justice Society who took up the mantle and had to figure out their relationship to their own heroes. Um, and in the same way, I mean, I would say that even though people have, you know, derided sort of Hal Jordan going crazy, and you know, this was obviously a product of editorial fiat. At the same time, it was intended to be permanent. I mean, it was the idea that here's the first major superhero at either company who is not only going to go bad and become a bad guy. There have been lots of villains who had become good guys, but this was the first major superhero who was going to go bad, and that was going to be permanent. And now, you know, now there's another Green Lantern, and things have changed. And you know, I like that kind of change, and I like keeping that kind of continuity and exploring the consequences. Another thing that comes to mind is the undoing of superhero marriages, whether it's, you know, Superman and Lois Lane, or it's Peter Parker and Mary Jane. Um, you know, there is a kind of, to me, a failure of the writerly imagination there. That, you know, we like to think of the superhero as essentially a young medium. I mean, essentially for young people. That, you know, here's a young teenage X-Men, and they're, you know, wrestling with teenage issues, and they go out and they're young and beautiful, and they fight Magneto. Um, you know, and that's fine, and we've certainly had enough of that. But what about an older character? What about a Peter Parker working as a school teacher, wrestling with, you know, his marriage, whether he wants kids, you know, his memory of, you know, his arguably his true love who's dead, and you know, yes, I love this woman, but I also know that I have this pain, and there was somebody else I loved in a different way. I mean, these are all, you know, what about being a parent? I mean, these are all stories that I think you can tell with superheroes, and I'd like to see more of. But I think that part of it is the failure of the imagination to tell, you know, stories that are maybe more sophisticated, maybe different with these same characters. Um, but you know, the other thing is those stories don't tend to do as well. I mean, when Superman Returns told I thought a beautiful story about, you know, a Superman who, you know, was still the same good guy, but who was wrestling with the fact that, you know, I have a kid, and I love someone, but I can't necessarily be a part of her life, you know, and maybe she was the one that got away, and now I've got to try to figure out how to be a parent. I mean, that's a very different Superman story, and people mocked it. You know, people, you know, it may not be perfect, and we can argue about it, but people mock the very idea that Superman would have a kid, and that a Superman movie would be about this kind of thing. Um,
Yeah,
well,
yeah,
we have to have room for that, or, you know, or else we're always going to revert to this sort of nostalgic nonsense status quo in which, you know, the characters have to be the same as they were in the '60s, and nothing can change.
yeah. I know. I was not that big of a that high on the Watchmen. I enjoyed some of the things that they tried to do, but to me, the execution sometimes was as trite as the things they were trying to critique. But one of the things that was good was the blue guy, Doctor Manhattan. He moves beyond the humanity. He's wrestling with the humanity, and he's sort of the Superman analog in a sense in that universe. And you know, after they killed off Superman, I know he came back as Blue and Red Superman. It would seem to me that a guy who, and putting aside the retcons, who'd been virtually immortal for 50 years, all of a sudden he's been dead. And you would think that he would have some qualms. I mean, you would think that he might develop a neurosis about fighting, that he would hold back, and that you could do an arc about, okay, here's, you know, Mr. X, the new super threat or whatnot, and Superman is reluctant to go after him because he's in the back of his mind. He's got who was the guy who beat him? The big spike guy was
Doomsday.
Doomsday. Yeah, Doom. You know that he would have some angst for the first time in his life, and here I've been a god. You know, bullets fly off me. I can go faster than the speed of light. Or at one point he could, uh, and now I know what it's like to be dead and then be resuscitated. And I maybe they did that kind of a story. I don't know. I remember the fourth Superman story was interesting because there was the robot that the bad guy. There was the was he the exterminator or something, there was another one, and there was the
Yeah.
reboot of the Superboy, and then there was the black Superman, John Henry, or whatnot. And I don't know if those characters still exist or whatnot, but I remember they were interesting. I would have liked to have seen that gone on for, let Clark Kent be dead for 5 years. I know the economics of it, but let him be dead for 5 years, then bring him back, or whatnot, and see how things have changed. And by the way, I wanted to ask, do you have a business sense of what percentage of new comics that are started up in, say, any given year actually last? Because I've been in the retail business and most products fail. So out of 100 comics that are started up, is it only 5 or 6 that last 5 or 10 years? Or
Yeah, I mean, once you're talking 5 or 10 years, yeah, you're talking about 5 or 6. I mean, um, most comics, just they don't last a year. I mean, of course, it depends whether you're talking about DC or Marvel, which start at higher sales than independent comics.
yeah,
I mean, most independent comics, I mean, people are losing money hand over fist, and between that and struggling for readers, it's very hard to keep doing it. Especially when you've got a day job and a wife and kids, and or a husband and kids. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think that you touched on the economics of it, which I think part of it is the culture and it's the sort of nostalgia. I mean, which I can't stand. I mean, I'm nostalgic too, but I don't need more stories, like those same ones that I read as a kid. And even if you did, like Big Bang Comics, does stuff like that, and people don't read it for the most part. I mean, I think it's great, but it's stylistically and tonally closer to, sort of Silver Age comics. What we've got instead is sort of the idea that, okay, Flash has to be Barry Allen forever, but now he's messed up because that's, somehow seen as, more modern, or, something that people can identify with more. We're going to make Hal Jordan Green Lantern again and say he never went bad, it wasn't his fault. I mean, and we're kind of going to restore this,
yeah,
kind of status quo. Um, that's not particularly interesting to me. I don't care about those characters. I care about great stories and new stories.
yeah,
So I agree with you. I think, and I think that some of it is that kind of culture of nostalgia, which is kind of an incestuous superhero culture. Some of it is also the economics, as you said. I mean, how do you sell Superman lunchboxes, right? And Superman stand-ups and T-shirts. If people don't know who Superman is, I mean, the reality of that story, as you say, is going through an experience like death and resurrection is probably going to change you. Furthermore, think of how many stories we've read in which characters are isolated in some kind of like dream or pocket universe in which like 1,000 years passes.
yeah.
And it's done over the course of an issue. And the next issue, Superman's right back to fighting, the prankster or whatever. No, I mean, having lived 1,000 years and 1,000 years without Lois Lane or anyone you knew, you're not going to just be the same guy after that.
Well, a perfect a
Um,
perfect example. I don't know if you ever watched Star Trek. One of the best Star Trek episodes, from the one with Picard, is where he's hit by an alien beam and he lives a lifetime in like 20 minutes on the deck of the starship, and he comes back, and speaking of like the Hal Jordan moment, there's probably the best moment in all of Star Trek, in that separate universe, is when Riker comes at the end of that show and gives like the little piccolo or flute that he had learned
right.
to play in his life. he gives it, and before he plays it, Stewart, just with his hands, the way he grasps that thing, you know he's lived a lifetime, and
Hmm.
and it's that kind of moment that should have been in a Superman comic when he got resurrected. That you know what I'm saying?
I do, and I mean, we could use Picard's flute as a kind of shorthand for this.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a new TV trick. Flute.
yeah, I agree completely. And I think that the comics culture is partly to blame, and the corporate culture is partly to blame. Um, I mean, another thing is, hey, if you've got a Superman who is maybe post-death kind of thinking, I'm different than these people. I mean, one of the things about Superman, and this is played out in Dr. Manhattan, as you said, is, I mean, you can identify with the human boy that you were raised to be by the Kents, but eventually the Kents are going to die.
Yeah.
And you're going to have seen enough alien worlds. I mean, if you've flown to alien worlds and seen all this stuff, you're not going to look at the streets of New York in the same way. I mean, your mentality, your psychology is going to change. And eventually you've got to reconcile yourself with the fact that you're not really human. And so, what are you doing stopping car accidents?
Yeah.
I mean, what are you going to feel about that after those kinds of experiences? But a Superman who says, maybe it's not my job to stop car accidents.
Yeah.
Maybe it's my job to do other things, whether it's, build renewable energy or fly off into the cosmos or whatever. If that's what the Superman comic becomes about, then when you do a Superman movie and it's a reboot and it's starting from, okay, here's who Superman is, and it's kind of the traditional Superman who hasn't gone through that process, and then the people who watch that movie go to read the comics and they say, who is this Superman? Now you've got a financial problem.
Yeah. Well,
They don't recognize that Superman.
well, one of the things that you mentioned, your second issue, one of the best things, and I thought it was the best story in that second issue, was the reboot or the retelling of the Lazarus myth from the Bible, and it I think dealt with the idea of someone who, and this goes beyond comics. When we talk about zombies and vampires and whatnot, they never get into the psychological thing. I saw something on Crack.com this morning about 5 bad reboots of comics, and there was the character Lobo from DC who was recast as sort of a Twilight looking vampire or something. They had the original Lobo was a fake Lobo or something, and it's all is this trend kind of thing. And that's one of the things that stuck out about the Martian comic. The second one was that you went back to a classical source, the Bible, and you put the Lazarus story on a human term, and that's what needs, I think, to be more. And just as a segue back to what you had said, and I want to end this segment. We'll do another final segment to end the interview, but just to end this segment, I wanted to talk about this trend of the last 30 years in the middle of that darkness is always more complex, and that's such bullshit because it's much harder in real life to be good because the human impulse is to be greedy, to be me. We're monkeys that lie. We've evolved to lie and to deceive and get on. It's much more difficult dramatically and psychologically to be good. To be dark is to just give in to the impulses. It's easy. It's lazy. This idea that a dark character is somehow more complex than a good one is bullshit. Now, that to me, a Superman, uh, okay, he's not human and he's more godlike. But if you had someone like a Superman that was less powerful, to me would be a much more interesting character than Bruce Wayne can ever be. Because there's very little to me that separates a Bruce Wayne from a Joker. But the
Yeah.
struggle that a character, maybe is Daredevil is not a superpowered, right? He's a real human. I mean, he's not a mutant human, right? In the
Well,
character Daredevil.
but he's blind, but he also has that radar sense. So
Okay,
he
so
does
he's
have,
got, but he could be killed by bullets, so he's human.
yeah.
So okay, so someone like a Daredevil, say more than a Bruce Wayne. I mean, he would have to. The struggle to stay good to me is much more interesting. So let me just ask you, just to end this segment, do you think that there's been so much that is just trendy or chic that, oh, let's make it dark? You know, what are your comments on that in comics, at least?
Well, I think, really, I mean, there are sort of notes in this direction in the 70s with the sort of social justice issues coming into comics and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
what was it?
Um,
Was it Green Lantern's side? No, Green Hornets. No, someone green had a
yeah.
sidekick who was a druggie.
Well, right, a Green Arrow,
Mm.
right? His sort of kid sidekick, Speedy,
Yeah,
was
right.
addicted to drugs.
Yeah,
Um, and then, you had sort of the Spider-Man drug issues and things like this. But really, it was in the '80s that, with revisionism, that all of this started. Now, the thing that people tend to forget about this, when we talk about the darkness and everything, is that the whole point of that darkness in the '80s was, if you already accept as the premise that Bruce Wayne is who he is and he's fighting crime, um, something's messed up about him psychologically. I mean, if this is what you decide to do, this is not normal. I mean, as you
yeah.
say, most people wouldn't do this. I often think of, there was an episode of, I think it was This American Life on NPR, where they interviewed people about what would you do with superpowers. People said I'd shoplift, I'd get to work faster, I'd spy on girls
Well,
using
it's the
invisibility. I
mask
mean,
effect. It's the mask
right,
effect.
right.
It's so if you people who wear a mask, this is why you have so many trolls online. They can't because and so they do things because they can't be identified. They do things online that they would never do in real life. It's the mask effect, and you never see that in the comics, which would be much more psychologically realistic.
Right, and the idea that you would fight crime
Yeah,
with superpowers. I mean, who is obsessed with crime?
yeah,
Like I mean, first of all, crime is probably lower right now than it ever has been in
yeah.
American history. But I mean, we don't have an epidemic of crime. I mean, I could understand maybe if you lived in, Prohibition Chicago, and you're a kind of Punisher style guy whose parents were killed by, mobsters or something. You decide to become the Untouchables, except
Yeah.
without a badge. I could maybe understand that. But I mean, in 2015, how many people drive home and they think, what I really can't get off my mind is the crime, these people flouting the law. I mean, that's just not a big issue. It's not something that and if that preoccupies your mind, you probably are a dark character. And then maybe you get the kind of twisted psyche that has been presented for a sort of Bruce Wayne. Um, but I mean, those are stories that, I can appreciate some of the artistic flourishes of, but they don't touch me because I'm not obsessed with crime, and I don't live in a universe that is filled with, supervillains. I mean, also, who gets the powers of the gods and decides that I want to rob banks with that power? I'm going to be, if you have the power to like fly through the universe or create illusions using your mind or something, if the first thing you think of is I'm going to become the new Dillinger and rob banks, again, something's wrong with you. I mean, um, so all of this is very bizarre, and I think that darkness that we see now is sort of, now we're sort of third generation after these revisionists who were trying to explore these psychological ideas, and that psychological depth is gone. That's been wiped away, and what's left is just guys beating people up and being super dark and being super twisted, and you know, it bores me too.
Yeah, it's sort of like the WWE in print, but
Yeah.
all right. So let's end this segment, then we'll come back. We'll end with a final segment. We'll give people your final thoughts on things, and we'll do that in a moment. Well, I want to wrap up my interview with Julian Darius, the founder of Sequart and a comic artist and a scholar. Want to just talk a little bit about the future. First, well, let's talk about the future of Martian comics and then the future of the medium. You said that you didn't have a definitive plan in mind for Martian comics. Do you see yourself perhaps 10, 20 issues if there's some success, turning it over to another writer and starting up another comic? Are you going to try to be an independent Stan Lee, or do you think you're going to see that particular comic through to the end?
Well, I want to be, an independent Stan Lee. The only question is whether there are whether the finances make sense. I definitely have other stories I want to tell. Some are set in the same universe, and some are set in other universes that are sort of incompatible with the dynamics that are set up in Martian comics. I definitely have a plan for Martian comics that will take us, 20, be somewhere maybe beyond issue 30. There are some related comics that I want to do that I'm working on. But I have a kind of at least an endpoint in sight that I might write stories after, but I don't really. I imagine I probably will, but I don't really want to get that far ahead of myself because it's scary enough as it is. I do want other writers to come in. I do want other people to come in, and I think that enhances the story. The only issue that I have right now is that I want to sort of finish laying the groundwork, and there are things that I just haven't done yet in Martian comics that are important to sort of solidify this universe and explain what the major points of this particular history is between Mars and Earth that I want to get done before I sort of invite other people in to play in that same playground.
So do you think that, to use an analogy, like Asimov did his original Foundation trilogy, and then later, years later, he added different stories. Do you see this as like maybe a 30 or 40 initial story, and then you'll do like, sort of side stories that occupy the same universe? That's basically what you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, right now what I'm looking at is there's that first story, The Girl from Mars, and we're running, backups that are sort of telling various stories throughout the history of Mars and Earth. There will be some side comics. I'm already working on sort of the first spin-off, and essentially, Girl from Mars will conclude at some point. I mean, I've had the outline from the first issue. And that will conclude, and then those things that presently seem to be backups will sort of take over the comic for a while. And I've got a lot of different stories to tell. That's kind of like volume 2. So basically, volume 1 and volume 2 are being published simultaneously. But volume 2 is a much more sort of ambitious kind of like Martian Chronicles thing set throughout history. And also kind of setting up all of these different themes, all of these different technologies, all of these different settings that can be explored in other stories, whether by me or by other writers. And then I do have a kind of ultimate, all of these elements come together in a sort of final Julian Darius story that kind of, it may not be my final story, but it kind of wraps up sort of the initial set of ideas that I have with a comic.
Yeah, my advice just artistically is don't milk it too much. Always leave questions, always leave certain things unanswered. You can have a major plot point, but you always have to leave the viewer wanting more. Otherwise you end up like Ridley Scott with that terrible Prometheus movie. I mean, when I saw that, I wanted to dig up his family graves for the 7 generations and just burn them. But so let's talk about the future of the medium. Where do you think 1525, the middle of the century, comic books or graphic novels will be? Do you think that there might be a turn away from superheroes? And if so, will it be a return to war comics? Do you think that there might be or is it just something nebulous that we're not going to know? That in 2030 there's going to be something that happens and it's going to shift the seismic underground of comics.
I don't know. I mean, I can't predict anything seismic in that way. I think there will be a shift away from superheroes. I think right now we're kind of riding this wave of superhero movies, which in some ways is still responding to 9/11. Yeah. They're very escapist. I mean, people aren't going to Guardians of the Galaxy to, interrogate the human condition. I think they're very escapist, and many of them are well-made escapism, but they're not doing anything more than that. Um, some of them are sort of interrogating some interesting themes, but that's about it. And that kind of disappoints me. I mean, I don't think they measure up to the best of superhero comics. Um, but I think that we're kind of riding that wave. I think that three things hopefully will push us away from this. One is digital and the lowering cost of entry for new players. So, I mean, in the same way that, I'm doing comics now, and it's something I've wanted to do for, 25 years or so, other people are doing that. And a lot of voices, whether they're women or minorities, who maybe don't have as much of an interest in superheroes, or maybe, for whatever reasons, whether discriminatory or otherwise, just have not had as many opportunities in the mainstream comics publishing industry. They're creating comics, and they're unlikely to tell the same old superhero stories, which are predominantly sort of young white male fantasies, or nightmares. But either way, I think that will tend to change. I think so. Digital increasing diversity. I also think that the international influence is bound to have an effect. I mean, the influence of manga on comics is profound.
Yeah.
I mean, it's led to a much more visual storytelling style. I don't think we'll ever be as sort of decompressed as most manga are, but I think that as digital certainly will allow us to explore comics from around the world, and as translation services, whether it's through a model like Amazon or it's through a sort of like better version of Google Translate, as that makes translation easier, we'll see on digital platforms, especially, a lot more international comics. So I hope for these extra voices, whether they're diversity or international voices, to help get us out of the superhero thing. I don't know that superheroes will ever die. I mean, I think that there's a momentum to American superhero comics, but I think it's you can easily see how it's essentially a niche market. And there probably will be new blood in that niche market of kids who grew up on these superhero movies and want to, not only make their own superhero movies, but make comics too. But I do see, a lot of factors that indicate that we won't have quite the same dominance of superheroes in 20 years as we do today. And I think that's entirely for the good.
Yeah. Let me ask three final little questions before I give you a final say. Number one, next year, Burke Breathed is bringing back Bloom County. I read. Do you think that's a good thing, or do you think he's just milking it? What is your sense? Do you think?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's an interesting comic. It's one I appreciate, and I mean, I guess I'm not opposed to somebody potentially milking it. I mean, I think that we as readers can ignore the stuff we don't like. It's easy to say I like this period of Little Nemo and not that period. It's easy to say I like Watchmen, but I don't like the prequels. I mean, so it doesn't bother me.
Okay. Second one. And I don't want, if you feel that I'm putting you on the spot, we can pass on. If you had to pick the best comic book, putting aside your own, best comic book and best comic book artist, be writer or illustrator, and the worst comic book and worst illustrator, who would you pick? And again, if that's going to put you in a Dutch, you don't have to answer it.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly very influenced by Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison. I grew up in that era. Jamie Delano's in there. I mean, some people who've been forgotten. Going back earlier, I mean, Will Eisner comes to mind. I adore Eisner, the Julius Schwartz 60s stuff. I don't know that I could say a single one. I mean, I certainly spent a lot of time as a kid looking at pages of Sandman and just thinking, how does Neil get these, caption-heavy pages with parentheticals to work, and just taking them apart? So, I mean, off the top of my head, those are a few. As far as worse, boy, I don't know. I mean, I think less of a particular creator who I can't stand, and more, just particular issues and stories that I can't stand. Some of them are sort of corporate event comics. I mean, did we need, something like Bloodlines running through the DC annuals? I mean, this stuff is virtually unreadable, and it tends to be a product of the sort of corporate mentality.
Yeah.
I think Jeff Johns, for example, is obviously a talented and capable writer. I like a lot of the stuff that he's done. On the other hand, some of the stuff he's done, I find, very difficult to read, especially some of the crossovers. Not all of them, but some of them.
Let me just, you brought up, before I get my final point, you mentioned Will Eisner. I think I had seen a documentary on the old Saturday morning cartoon, and I would think this would be part of Sequart, Johnny Quest. Is it true that Johnny Quest's artwork was somehow based on Eisner's work, and there was some idea about the guy who did Johnny Quest being accused of stealing from Eisner? Am I misremembering, or was that an issue that you might have know about?
I don't know about that. I mean,
Okay.
there might be some sort of Alex Toth influence there. I mean, I know, like, Toth was active in Space Ghost, and
Okay.
that I do think a lot of that kind of like simplified animation style, while some of it was a product of a sort of especially like at Hanna-Barbera, the kind of limited resources available and keeping things cheap. I mean, you could argue, the entire sort of like DC animated line is kind of a riff on top. But yeah, I don't know that about the original Johnny Quest stuff.
Okay. And my final question before I give you your final say, I remember a couple of months ago, I was looking up when I first booked you to appear. I was looking up something about Batman related to some of the questions I'd asked earlier, and I saw a few like web forums with like 1,200, 1,600 comments on Batman versus James Bond, who would win? And so this is just a fun question. And I was saying, to me, in a neutral universe, I would think James Bond would have to win, because even if he was not, even though he's not a superhero, in a neutral universe, James Bond has no compunction against killing. He's a war veteran and hardened, and as much money as billionaire Bruce Wayne could have into funnel, it can't match what the UK could provide Bond with Q and whatnot. And so, of course, in the Batman universe, Batman would win. In the Bond universe, Bond would win. But in a neutral universe too, Bond is an agent and he's a de facto good guy. Whereas in a neutral universe, Batman is a lawbreaker. So I don't know. So just for fun, is that would you agree with my analysis? Because it was like 98% Batman in who would win. Just as a fun thing.
It's tough though. I mean, right? Because it depends which Batman you're talking about. It depends which Bond you're talking about.
Yeah.
I mean, are you talking about the sort of like rebooted Bond that is I mean, compared to him, Batman is a kind of fantasy character living in a totally, bizarre universe, like with magic and bizarre technologies that aren't really reflective of real technologies. On the other hand, there's, like the 70s, early 80s Bond. So I don't know.
Yeah. So I know you'd have to sort of pit Adam West against Roger Moore Bond, to have it fit.
Well, Roger Moore beats Adam West, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, Connery beats West. I think like the Christian Bale Batman, it's hard to. I mean, yeah, I can see Bond beating him because he mostly occupies. I mean, really, those films are based on the Bond films in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Nolan wanted to have that same kind of level of technology with M's got the cool tech and it's close enough to reality that it doesn't feel like a crazy supervillain Magneto weapon.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I could see it. On the other hand, the sort of traditional Batman, at least of the last 10, 15 years, is one who, you know, uh, somehow always triumphs and has unbelievable resources that he can pull from his back pocket. So I think it depends which version of these characters are fighting each other.
Yeah.
But I like what you're saying about Bond being not only being willing to kill, but also having this kind of training.
Because if Batman's not going to kill the Joker after 70 plus years or whatever it is, I don't see him trying to take out Bond because anyway. But it's been an enjoyable interview, Julian Darius, and for people who've enjoyed this interview, you can see links to his websites below. Let me just give you a minute or two to say whatever you'd like to say.
Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. It's been a pleasure and a joy. I've really enjoyed your questions and probing all of these things. If listeners, viewers are into comics and want to take comics seriously, check out Sequart, check out our documentaries, check out our books. I mean, we really are a mom and pop company still, and we have an open submissions policy if you're interested in getting involved and writing for the website or doing anything else. And we really are true believers in not only comics as literature, but comics as a legitimate art form that can stand alongside film or literature or anything else and explore its strengths and its unique strengths.
And by the way, you said you also publish books. So if someone had, let's say, a sci-fi book, or if they had a monograph that's an analysis of, say, Robert Heinlein, is there a page that they could go to on Sequart for submission details or guidelines?
Yeah, if you go to sequart.org/books, I think at the bottom of that, or you can just go to the website and click on the About Us,
Okay.
which lists submission guidelines. And at the same time, boy, if anyone is interested in independent comics that are, trying to escape the dominance of not just superheroes, but also kind of like thoughtless superheroes,
Just
the kind of
mindless
thoughtlessness.
violence, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
the mindless violence and the kind of like stories where you finish and you say, okay, that was mildly fun, but I mean, it's one chapter of a larger thing, and I don't really know what it has to say about anything. If you're interested in stories that not only supporting independent creators, but also stories that are about something, check out Martian Comics. I mean, it's very dear to my heart, and it really needs readers to survive.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Julian Darius. If anyone enjoyed this trip down the history of comic books, next week we'll be expanding out a bit more. I'm going to have a debate with 4 cosmologists who have alternatives to the Big Bang Theory. So that'll be next week. And again, Julian, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been quite a pleasure.